Welcome to Life's Dirty Little Secrets. I'm Emma Waddington.
And I'm Chris McCurry. And today we are exploring the disconnection paradox with Dr. Jonathan Kanter. We're very privileged and pleased to have him with us. Jonathan is a research associate professor at the University of Washington in Seattle, where I reside. He directs the Center for the Science of Social Connection and is the University of Washington Director of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Training and Education. His work sits at the intersection of contextual behavioral science, relationship science, and social justice. And he spent many years collaborating with marginalized communities on issues of racism, discrimination, and how we connect across the differences that typically divide us. So, Jonathan, welcome to Life's Dirty Little Secrets.
Thank you, Chris. And thank you, Emma. Let me just say right from the start that I think we're going to talk about some fairly difficult stuff. And I should be clear that I am in no way representing the University of Washington in anything I say, or the University of Washington Medicine, which is where I am the director of EDI training, but I will not be representing UW Medicine today, given our conversation topics.
Okay, good to know. So a lot of people that you and I know say that they've stopped watching the news, or they've cut off family members over politics, or they just feel kind of numb to what's going on. Can you tell us from your research psychologically what's going on and what we might actually do about this?
Yeah, and I think it's even worse, right, than just stopping watching the news or cutting off relationships or simply trying to over-control what we talk about during dinner. Sometimes it's as much as not knowing how to respond when somebody just says, "How are you?" Right? It's usually a pretty simple question. We usually just say, "Fine." And maybe that's what we say now too. We just say, "Fine." But there's something not fine, right? For many of us as we're facing everything going on in this world. And there is this weird disconnect or paradox. Because on the one hand, most of us are fine. We're going about our days. But on the other hand, the world seems to be crumbling around us. I think that's the dilemma that we hopefully can unpack a little bit today. And I can add, I want to be clear, as we lean into this, we're talking about a lot of hardship that some of us, maybe not the three of us on this call right now directly, but some of us are really facing directly. And that's different. We have people who are quite literally and directly being threatened, being kicked out of our country, being chased around by ICE agents, being told that their genders are no longer acceptable, they can't get health care. The list, of course, just goes on and on. If you're fighting for Palestinian rights, for example, you can be very threatened, among many other things. So I just want to be clear as we start this conversation that we'll be talking about this. Most of society is facing this paradox in which our days are relatively normal, but if we read the news or talk to people around us, we are aware that things seem to be crumbling, but also to recognize with as much empathy as possible, but that's not everyone here. Some people are really struggling, and that's a different conversation. Just want to name that as we start.
That distinction is really important. So if we perhaps focus, for the time being anyway, on those of us who thankfully are living, fairly good lives. And that paradox that you described where we're seeing things that are really hard to see and witness and hurt us. I've had many situations where I have watched or read about things and I can feel, a deep sense of distress, disgust, upset. But along with it comes this helplessness. I don't actually know what I can do. I know that I want to do something, but I don't know what I can do. And then I feel powerless. And then it does sometimes feel like the easiest thing to do is just to keep putting one foot in front of the other and push this aside. And I guess that's what we call hypernormalization, in as much as that, we just accept that we can't change.
It's rough. Let's try to unpack what you just said, hypernormalization. Let me give you all 3 examples. Chris, Emma, I'd love to hear your reactions to these examples. The first one, historical. Not sure if it's actual real history or just a legend, but I learned it, so I'll share it. 1937, Joseph Stalin is giving a speech for the Communist Party. And at the end of the speech, the ovation in the audience lasted over 11 minutes. Everyone was scared to be the first one to stop applauding because of the totalitarian regime, the massive violence. They called this the Great Purge at the time, or the Great Terror, during which Stalin was consolidating his totalitarian power, executing and imprisoning political rivals and so forth. Everyone in the room was scared to stop applauding. The legend has it, according to the historian who wrote the little thing that I read about it, that the person who finally did stop first after 11 minutes was indeed arrested and thrown in prison for 10 years. So here we have people applauding when they don't, acting like it's a normal end of a speech when it's really not, right? That's example number 1. Number 2, this is more famous. If you've seen the movie, The Titanic, that's a real event, 1912. The Titanic is sinking, and the band, first, according to historians, the band was instructed to continue playing by the captain in the service of maintaining calm and providing comfort. But as the ship continued to sink, the band voluntarily decided to keep playing, to stay until the end. They sacrificed themselves in order to keep playing their music, in order to support the others who were trying to escape, most of whom didn't escape successfully. Legend has it that the final song they played was called Nearer My God to Thee. I listened to it the other day in preparation for this meeting. It's a very religious song, which is not my thing, but it's a beautiful song. And I encourage you to listen to the song and imagine this band playing it and wonder what was going through their minds as they were playing this song. That's example number 2. Ready for one more? This one I'm just going to make up, but I think we know what it feels like. Let's just imagine 2 days before your big birthday party, you receive a very serious cancer diagnosis. You choose to try to just have a normal birthday party, have as good a time as possible. You don't let anybody know. Imagine that feeling of that birthday party for you and what you're struggling with. So these are my 3 examples to sort of set the stage. In each case, well, let me ask you, how do you, as you think about these 3 examples, applauding at Stalin's speech, playing music as the Titanic is sinking, and pretending everything's fine at your birthday party, what do these 3 have in common? How are they different? I'm curious if you have reactions, Chris or Emma.
Well, starting with the middle one, the musicians on the Titanic. If it was in fact the case that, my violin and I were not going to get on a rowboat, lifeboat, like it was pretty clear that I was going down with the ship, women and children first, whatever. I think I'd want to go out the way I lived. I think I'd want to go out playing my instrument till the very end, because that's
really nice.
what I valued and in my life, and that was what was important to me and a lot of my identity. So I think I would have made the choice to do what they did. One never knows when confronted with those situations, but I would like to believe that I'd go out playing. I'm not so sure about, what I would have done in the situation, the audience for Stalin's speech. It's just unimaginable to be living under those conditions, although, we may have lots of opportunity to more than imagine that in the next few months and years. So I don't know. I think I might fake a heart attack or something and try to get out of it that way. But and my birthday party, I would probably put up a good front. I try to believe in the aphorism from Stoicism, which is live every day as if it were your last. So we don't know, if that's going to be the last day of our lives or the last birthday party or whatever. So I think the important thing is to be present and be there for your friends and loved ones, and not dampen the mood for anybody else.
I just listening to Chris, I think, there's a lot of courage in everything you've described, all those 3 scenarios. I found I had different reactions, as in when you asked what do they have in common, maybe I'll start with what is different. I felt the terror of the first. Like the first thing that comes to mind when I think of being in that situation is my family. Really feeling incredibly protective of, what happens to me, but also what could potentially happen to my family. Should I do something that's, goes against the party line? The second example, the Titanic, felt very different because it wasn't fear. It felt incredibly courageous. I found it very moving. The thought that they continued to play, I found that just so touching. And what would it take? I mean, is it like the Milgram experiments? Are we talking about, where we just do what everybody else is doing because it feels safer to do something in a group than it does to step outside of that?
And can you briefly describe the Milgram experiments for those listeners who may not be familiar with that?
Well, after the Second World War, I think there was a flurry of interest in social psychology, trying to understand how those, average humans, such as those that were living in Nazi Germany, could choose to act in ways that would go against our values in many ways, harm, kill, exclude, really put other humans in tremendous danger by following orders. So this felt like something that had obviously never happened before or to that extent. And there was an academic curiosity around that. And so there was a series of experiments that came off the back of that. And one was done by Milgram. I can't remember his first name. Stanley, well done. Psychology 101. And then there was the Stanford prison experiment as well at the time. And what Milgram set up, and correct me if I'm wrong, because it's been a while since I studied these experiments, but I remember being very shocked when I heard about them. What he set up was an experiment where you had the experimenters and then you had the participants, subjects, and they were sitting attached to electrodes. And they were asked questions, very simple questions, like, if I remember correctly, it was pears, right? What goes with salt, pepper? My recollection was that the questions were pretty easy, and so they should really have been able to answer. So the experimenter that would ask the participant to increase the level of electricity that this poor subject was being delivered, depending on whether they, made a mistake or not. So the subject that was also with the experiment, but they didn't know, the participants didn't know, would start to make mistakes. And the lead, the boss, as it were, would say, come on, increase the electricity. This guy is not getting it right. He deserves to be sort of electrocuted. And there was a dial. And as the participant increased the dial, he could see that on the dial it said, dangerous. And it went all the way up to lethal.
Which was all fake.
It was all fake, yes. It was all fake.
Right. The person wasn't really getting electrocuted, but they were acting as if they were.
They were. And the participant didn't know that it was fake, which is the most troubling part. And so they did follow orders, but I can't remember how many participants actually turned the dial as high up as to the level where it could actually physically kill the subject. I remember.
I think the vast majority did. And they were using American college students as the control group, and then they were going to go to Germany and do it with German citizens to see if the German citizens, in fact, went further than the Americans. And since it was clear that the Americans were going all the way, they didn't even bother to go to Germany.
So this is great. It feels like my work as your host as your guest is done today. I asked you to talk about these three examples, and now we're just in deep, aren't we, on our topics? If I remember correctly, it was like 65% of the subjects turned up the voltage all the way to the max because the experimenter, the scientist in the room was telling them to.
I'm just reading. It said danger, severe shock. That's the label, danger, severe shock. And despite hearing the actor screaming, complaining of heart problems, and eventually fall silent, The participants showed significant distress, but continued when the experimenter prompted them with phrases like, "The experiment requires you to continue."
I'm trying to find a way to fit the Milgram experiment into my hypernormalization discussion. Like we can put it all together. In my opinion, what the three examples, the Stalin applauding and the Titanic band and going to the party when you've got that diagnosis, what they have in common is relatively straightforward. In each case, the people in the examples are all pretending normalcy. It's all like a sort of a theater of an act of normalcy, right? That's what I think they have in common. What's different is what's causing them to act this way, right? In the Stalin case, it's the threat of punishment. If you don't act normal, you're going to get severely punished, and that threat is very real, and it's real for many people today. I would say that in the Titanic case, at first they were instructed to do that by the captain, so they were sort of following rules because that's what they were supposed to do. If you're on the ship, the captain gives you a rule, you follow it. But then something else happened, right? And I like how you put it, Chris. It became about their values, about a personal choice, how you want to live your life, which maybe you disagree with what they did or maybe you don't. But if you believe in the idea of a value-driven life and ending that way, then it's switched from following rules to following your values, and it's probably a nice way. And then the third one is different. Maybe you're hiding your medical diagnosis to your friends and family because you don't want to upset them. So it's like the social contingencies are at play. You don't want to upset people. Or maybe you just are avoiding, it's just emotional avoidance yourself. You don't want to feel or show your feelings in front of people. So it's more of a personal emotional avoidance. So we have all these reasons, different contingencies, different forces on us that are pushing us to sort of act normal, to maintain the status quo. And as we think about what's happening today, going back to where we started, this idea that somebody asked me, "How are you?" And I say, "Oh, I'm fine," even though that's kind of an act of normalcy, but it's also kind of true. I'm not sure. Maybe we can all think about it together. How much of it is threat of punishment or just following rules or just my own avoidance? But it's something I think it's worth paying attention to. In any event, that was what we call hypernormalization. The term was actually coined by a Russian scholar at UC Berkeley to initially talk about what was happening in Soviet Russia when it was collapsing, the Stalin example. But I think it can be broadened to really fit how a lot of us are struggling today. This sense that we're having this normal life. We can just look at TikTok and watch the news and social media and Instagram. We can watch jokes about how horrible things are on Saturday Night Live or The Daily Show. And that just allows us to treat it all as normal and to go about our days when, if I can use the metaphor of the Titanic, the sinking feeling that it's not normal.
I think it has a lot to do with compartmentalization. I mean, the birthday party example, it's like, I'm going to compartmentalize things for the sake of this, this event. And I think of all the families I've worked with over the years who went through divorces, and for the sake of the children, they tried to be as normal as possible, and I would often recommend things like, mom's house and dad's house have the same soap in the bathroom, the same sheets on the beds, because those tactile, sensory, evocative things are really important. And it's, comforting to have that normalcy going back and forth between two different houses, again, for the sake of the kids. And then if you're going to have disagreements, you do that as the adults away from the kids. I think there's some utility to normalization. Hypernormalization obviously makes it sound like it's into toxic territory.
Yeah, I'll say today, I like how you put it. We need to be flexible in not just pathologizing this whole process. And the question is, when is this pretending to be normal functioning in the service of who we want to be and reasonable compromises in hard and unreasonable situations? And when is this hypernormality actually backfiring on us? I'll suggest there's probably at least two, maybe more, but two ways in which it can backfire on us. The first is if we're not really an activist in our soul, if we're not wanting to get out on the streets and protest and fight for change, right? We're just wanting to lead a normal life and focus on our kids, not a bad thing. Focus on the people around us who we love. Is this attempt to treat everything as normal, to push it all aside, is that making your life smaller and smaller over time? Is that forcing you to make decisions to not have certain conversations, to not have certain meetings, to not watch certain things on television, and your life is getting smaller in a way that we as therapists are very familiar with? Is it moving you into sort of a clinical avoidance mode or not? And then I think the second way it can be problematic is if you really do want to get out there and fight for social change, but that hopelessness has got a hold of you, and the effort to avoid feeling hopeless when you can't actually find a solution has just shut you down. I like to think of myself as a little bit of both. I sometimes have described myself as having the soul of an activist trapped in the body of a scientist, but I'm also not as courageous as some of these activists. But I really want to help those who want to be activists to overcome that hopelessness, to overcome the pressure to just treat it as normal and status quo, so they can get out there and live their best lives and fight for change. And I think that's particularly hard right now when we have all of these forces of normalization buffeting us.
My wife, whom you both know, has a little sign next to her desk that says, "This isn't normal."
Oh, yeah.
As a daily reminder that, we can't get complacent about these things.
Well, it's so tricky. And as you know, I love and respect your wife, but it's also a good example of how we can even take the effort to remind ourselves that things aren't normal and sort of normalize it. Like I can think, oh, I want to go get one of those signs that say this isn't normal. I can probably get it on Amazon this evening and have it on my desk by tomorrow, as I'm actually not doing anything differently. I love noticing that tendency in myself to watch a movie, about what's happening in the West Bank and in Palestine and Israel, or to watch a movie about the struggle of Black America, and to leave that movie feeling really shaken and stirred up and emotional. And in that moment, to believe that I've actually done something activisty, but I haven't. I've just seen a movie. And I say this with no pride, but just to try to normalize and, increase awareness of these little things we do, because we don't know what else to do. Let me throw one more example at you. Back to ship sinking, if I can. You are the captain of a World War II Navy cruiser battling the Japanese Navy in the Pacific. And your cruiser has just been hit by 2 Japanese torpedoes and you're sinking. What do you do? You're not in a good situation.
I suspect there's probably some training that I would have to rely on. Where somewhere in my training, they anticipated a situation like this and gave us a few things that we might do to save as many people on the ship as possible. Lower the lifeboats, batten, close off the hatches, send a distress signal.
Chris, there are protocols to follow in this situation if you have been trained in them, right? And the reason I give you this example, and it's a terrible example, because I think it helps us overcome hopelessness. And what I'm about to say is easy to say and hard to do. But I think so many of us may feel helpless or hopeless right now, and it's largely a function of being unable to identify a new goal. And I think identifying a new goal requires some deep acceptance work, easy to say, hard to do. I think it's about quickly, if it's the case of your ship sinking, accept, grieve, and pivot, right? Okay, maybe if your ship's sinking, you save the grieving for later. You just accept and pivot. But I think if we think about what's going on today and we feel hopeless, I think it's largely because we're unwilling to let go of the first goal and find a new, smaller, more doable goal. But there is always something that can be done. And even if your ship is really sinking, there are still things you can do to save lives in that instance. And that's exactly what happened. The case I'm thinking of, I was reading about it last week. I'm weird this way. I don't know why I'm coming up with so many like metaphors from Stalinist Russia and World War II, but it was the USS Northampton during the Battle of Tassafaranga, 1942. And apparently, because this captain so quickly pivoted to the we're sinking protocol and gave up the goal of we're going to win this battle, hundreds of lives apparently from the ship were saved over the next 3 hours as he got everybody out. They salvaged everything. They did all the things. And then he also was saved as well. To me, it's a very hard lesson. But I think it helps us if we can really get away from the hypernormalization and take a look plainly at the situation we're in. Then the step is accept and grieve and then pivot to what can be done.
Well, this reminds me of a podcast we did fairly recently with Tamara Hubbard. We're talking about parenting kids with food allergies. And she was talking about the what ifs, kids asking, what if this, what if that, which is true for lots of kids, who are facing anxious situations. And she was saying what she does is she tries to coach parents to replace the what if with if then.
Oh, yeah.
So when the kid says, what if, you say, well, if then. And so you have a strategy or protocol, something that you can rely on. And whether, it's the ship captain or EMTs coming upon a hideous auto accident, you fall back on your training and you do what needs to be done. And then later you freak out because you were just dealing with all this, terrible stuff. But in the moment, you're in the zone and you're doing what needs to be done. So I think, some of us had strategies, protocols, some if-thens that would be helpful.
I wonder if it would be useful. It would be for me, sort of in summary, when I was thinking about this conversation today in hypernormalization, what we're talking about is the space we get into when we're watching things unfold in the world, in our lives that feel really, really wrong. This shouldn't be happening. And like Sue, this is not normal. We don't want this to be the truth in the world. But what often comes with it is either this sort of acceptance that there's nothing I can do, or this hopelessness. So the hypernormalization, does it cover both? This sort of sense, well, there's nothing I can do. Let's just move forward, put one step in front of the other and let others fix it. Or this hopelessness that is, there's nothing I can do. So a bit like in Stalin's situation, really, there was little people could do unless they risked their lives and were incredibly brave. Is that what we're talking about when we talk about hypernormalization? Does it cover both of those camps? Because it feels like, for me, when I look at the world, when I think, I often get very upset about things, and then I'll get upset because I don't know what to do, and then I'll get self-critical because I'm not doing anything, and this kind of, it can become quite a big emotional experience, and then what ensues is nothing changes. And then I'll watch another movie and get upset and the whole cycle begins. But the reality is that I haven't changed much. So I
think it's going to look different for different people depending on our situations. I think the impulse to try to keep things normal, to try to keep things status quo, to have difficulty with recognizing that something really bad is happening, I think that's really almost universal, depending on your history and how much trauma you've had in the past and so forth. But again, I think the functions, what drives it, can be different. For some of us, it really could be threat of punishment. I can't get into the minds or hearts of, say a Republican senator right now who seems to be going along with a bunch of craziness. But I'm guessing there's a decent amount of threat, similar to stopping clapping, to Stalin. In my case, I don't think the tendency to try to just keep things as normal is because of that kind of threat. I think it's probably just because of the discomfort or the hopelessness of not knowing what to do if what I'm scared to believe is true is actually true. I think there's a lot of different kinds of forces that keep us away from those feelings. I think we all want to believe in a just world. We all want to believe that the things we do have efficacy. And it's just really hard to face it when it's not so simple. And I think there are times in life, in the world, when it's unfortunately required to say, hey, this is different. And we have to get out of this everyday same thing mold, and we have to start acting differently. It's really hard. That's the pivot, right? This ship is sinking. I have to see that clearly and pivot. And we haven't received the training and the protocols that Willard Kitts, the captain of the Northampton, had received. So it's harder for us.
And so let's talk about that pivot, because I think that's key for me to think about, how do we pivot? So the example of the sinking ship is a fantastic one, in as much as, if we start to deny that the ship is sinking, we are going to die.
Yeah.
We talked earlier about this analogy of the water balloon. The human is capable of holding a lot of distress, and there is a cost to not holding that distress, and that is not to accept that this ship is sinking or whatever that might be happening. What is the reality, right? You turn away and there are costs to that, costs of disconnection, cost of, not talking to people, cost of the world not changing. And so we need to make room for that.
Yeah, and the good news is, let me make it easier, because I think if we stick with the metaphor that I provided, that we're all on a sinking ship, that's a rough one. So let's try to make it a little easier. The truth is, none of us can predict the future, right? We don't know how things are going to turn out in our society. We don't know how things are going to turn out with midterm elections, much less beyond that. So we can't predict the future. It does look like things are going poorly at the moment. Like it does look like the ship has been hit by torpedoes. Maybe it's sinking. Maybe it can get back to port. Not sure yet, right? The good news is the action that most people have to take is available to them. There are people every day going to work in various nonprofit organizations, in various activist spaces, in various protest movements that have protocols for this. We all don't have to reinvent the wheel. We just have to join. The way to get mass societal change is to build a mass societal movement. We just need to break our normal cycle and start spending time in those spaces with these people who are waking up every morning and going to work on change. These protocols exist. We just have to join. And that makes the task simpler.
So it's like joining the bucket brigade when a house is on fire.
Exactly. Everyone has a role to play, but we don't want to get too narcissistic. I'm not going to change the world on my own, but I'm going to participate in a movement that does, and that's good enough for me.
That's the key in a way, is that we all often get stuck in thinking that nothing we do will make a difference.
Well, there's two ways to look at it, right? It is true. And I think there are historians and scholars, sociologists and other scholars who know this much better than I do. But it is true that at the level of real societal change, it really is a numbers game, right? We just need more people on the streets more often, right? Just got to build those numbers, got to build a bigger tent, got to have the political party, the Democrats, not be so exclusive, because that's the opposite of building a big tent. That it's the numbers game to a certain extent. And then the other way to look at it is you always have some leverage and some control over your local environment. You just might have to think smaller and smaller. It's that old story, which we've all probably heard some version of the young child walking the beach after the storm, picking up the starfish that have washed ashore, thousands of them dotting the shoreline, right? You might know where I'm going with this. And one by one, throwing the starfish back into the sea. And then the grumpy old man like me comes along and says, "You're never going to throw all the starfish back, And this child says, I know, but I'm going to throw this one back." So there's something to be said for, if we can't change the world, we can at least make sure our loved ones around us are supported and cared for as much as possible right now. We can talk to our neighbors. We can, when we go to work, talk to our team. How are you doing? Listen and say, when I say, "How are you?" and you say, "Fine," I'm open to a different answer if you'd like. Again, it's about pivoting, finding goals that are doable. There's a lot we can do. We get stuck in this hopelessness, and then the easiest way to not feel hopeless is to just avoid the whole thing. But of course, that doesn't produce new behavior, new action. That just produces avoidance. And this is the dilemma of life that we all struggle with and that we try to help our clients with. And it's easy, again, for me to say and hard to do. But I just think in times like this, it really is important to sort of go back to fundamental principles and just do the best we can with them.
And to have the confidence that we can, in our small part, make a difference. There's this parable, The Legend of the Hummingbird. Have you heard of it? It's from the Quechua people of South America.
I do believe I bought that book for my daughter years ago, but please remind me. Yeah.
Oh, it's a lovely story. It goes, a great fire sort of breaks off in the forest, and all the animals flee to safety and stand on the edge and watch helplessly as their homes burn, and they feel overwhelmed and paralyzed by the enormity of the disaster. But a small hummingbird flies back and forth to the river, carrying tiny drops of water in its beak to drop on the flames. And again, it goes. And the other animals mock the hummingbird, saying, what do you think you're doing? You're too small. This won't make a difference. And the hummingbird replies, I'm doing what I can.
That's the story. Yeah.
Yeah, it's so lovely because, like you said, right, the child who throws the starfish into the water, it's important to know that we can do something, even if, like the hummingbird, it's just drops of water. And it may not put out the whole fire. But perhaps if we had a school of, hummingbirds who could put out the fire, it would take a long time, depends how big the fire is. Realizing that we do have a sphere of influence, and don't have to be paralyzed by, the scale of a challenge, that we do have a part to play. It's really important to feel empowered.
That's the message for me. And I also have to validate that, again, it's easy to say, hard to do. And the forces of the status quo and of normalization are strong. And as a contextual behavioral scientist, I have to honor that these environmental forces against action are strong right now. And they serve other functions. If somebody forwards me a joke about, an ice agent running and falling on the ice and everyone's laughing, if I watch a Saturday Night Live skit about the politics, there's some sort of catharsis. There's something that happens in those moments where you can just laugh and express some emotion. And that's not bad, right? And there's also something, I think, that it's like you see it and it helps you make sense of what otherwise is a crazy situation. It's like validating. It's sense making, it's catharsis. It's, I'm not crazy. This joke gets me, right? I'm not crazy. And then we feel sort of good for a moment, which reduces the impulse to do something more. It's like a short-term fix that allows us to, even though it's not intended to, like the people who are writing these jokes, they probably want to get out and change the world too. They're just doing what they can do. It produces a short-term fix that feels good in the moment, and then it makes it harder to wake up the next morning and really join that organization. Get out in the bucket brigade. This is the challenge that we face in life.
Well, it also, creates more us and them. And a lot of people don't want to admit it, but, the ICE agents, they've got their values, they've got their rules, they've got their upbringing, they've got all that stuff that has led them to this point in their lives. And we wish they were making different choices, but that's who they are at the moment. And we're not going to change any of their hearts and minds by dehumanizing them or not having some compassion for them and what they're doing, the situation that they put themselves in there. And, we don't even know what kind of moral injury they're going to come away with from the things that they're doing.
Yeah, that's a really good reminder, Chris. It's funny, you introduced me as the director of my little research center, the Center for the Science of Social Connection, where we're all about how do we build bridges and empathy and understanding and relationships across these differences that typically divide us. And then instead of talking about that today, I've been using war metaphors over and over again. And I guess the way to put all that together is both of these things can be true. I do think some people are treating this as we are under attack. There are people really threatening, and that's true too. And I think there's something to be said about distinguishing the people in power who are really trying to control and produce social change that is the opposite of what we want. There's tremendous corruption and dishonesty and lying and manipulation. That's all part of the war, the attack, and that's real. Distinguish those people pulling those strings from everyone else, from the masses of society, including people who have political beliefs that are different from our own, including people who are engaging in actions that we find offensive, but who are more like the participants in that Milgram experiment, who didn't know any better and for whom the contingencies were arranged in such a way that they were producing this behavior that I find abhorrent. It's different being the participant in that experiment under the control of those contingencies and being the experimenter who set the whole thing up to manipulate people.
Well, and when they debriefed the people in the Milgram experiments and told them what had actually occurred, the participants were horrified by what they had done. After the whole thing settled down, once they were out of the context of being berated into increasing the voltage.
Yeah, the Milgram experiment was set up to try to help us understand that refrain that was, alive after World War II, to try to understand, the masses of German people and soldiers who went along with Hitler, by saying I was just following orders. It's really hard to unpack that. It's really hard to try to put yourself in those shoes and not say to yourself, I would have been different. And it's really hard to recognize there is a common humanity, that, we all are social creatures controlled by the forces around us more than we want to believe. It takes rare but great acts of moral courage to break through that, to be that person who, if the legend is correct, stopped clapping after 11 minutes. I hope I've expressed the requisite humility talking about this today by repeating more than once. This is easy to say, hard to do.
That's true.
I was just thinking about this idea of fierce compassion. Does this relate to it at all? Because I can see us holding to the two truths. The reality is that we are human, and that being human means that we have certain tendencies, tendencies that perhaps, if we think about the Milgram experiments and so many others that show that we do follow orders. We do listen to people in authority. We do things that can be really quite run against our values in those contexts. That, we are in that way. Experiments have demonstrated there's many of us that fall into the vast majority fall into that category, but at the same time, things happen that are wrong. That's true too. It's both true. And so from this idea of fierce compassion is that we can have compassion and we can also call out what's wrong.
Yeah, I'm all in. That brings back to the idea of the water balloon that you mentioned earlier. I love the idea that what we are as humans when we're at our best is like a water balloon that can just fill up with as much sort of seemingly contradictory information, with as much different kinds of pain and suffering, and find a way to accept it all and just to continue to take it in and to grow and to learn and to gain wisdom by just taking it all in, rather than just deciding on a single narrative or a single truth. It's possible to just hold all of it and not pop, to stick with the water balloon metaphor, and to find wisdom in all that. I'm not sure if I've found the wisdom yet, but that certainly is a vision of mine. I also like to think of, from couples therapy, and now from, if anyone is following the sort of restorative justice work that has gotten a little popular in some circles, there's this idea of multi-partiality. The idea that when I'm having an interaction with anybody or with two people who are in conflict, I can hold both perspectives as valid, and I can even hold a third perspective in the room, sort of a metaphorical perspective, which is the power difference between the two of them, the differences in power and privilege and dynamics between the two of them. That's also true. And to try to make sense of it through holding all three things as true, the two different viewpoints, which are really in opposition, the power differences and the histories which have produced those differences. That's all very abstract, but I think it just speaks to the possibility that we have to do a better job of, it's the oldest phrase in the book, switching from either or to both and, as we try to understand the world. But I don't know if that's what you need if you're in the middle of a war. And I want to hold that contradiction too.
True. Yeah, because we talk about both and a lot in couples therapy. Obviously, this is, a big piece is being able to hold your truth and their truth and move forward with those two truths being a part of the relationship.
Well, we're so close to coming up with the answer that will solve all of this, but I'm afraid we're running out of time. 5 more minutes, and I know we could have done it.
We're right on the edge of really finding it.
Yeah.
That's
Listen,
right.
the answer all I can offer to people, if I have any wisdom at this point in my life, it's simply that I'm going to wake up tomorrow morning, and I'm going to see the day in front of me, and I'm going to try to remind myself of my values, and I'm going to try to have the best day possible and lead as close of a life to my valued life as I can. And then my wisdom tells me that at the end of the day tomorrow, I'm going to probably look back at that day and think that I failed. And then I'm going to go to sleep and wake up the next morning and try again.
Yeah. We keep pivoting.
Right.
Yes. I look forward to thinking about the small things that I can do. Like you said, it's the pivots. It's where's the hummingbird in my life?
Or be the hummingbird.
Yeah. Yeah, be the hummingbird.
Well, thank you both for inviting me on. I really enjoy talking to you.
Yes. Thank you so much.